In order to consider Amendment Number 34, printed in House Report 114-623. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk and rise as a designee of Mr. Pompeo from Kansas.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 34, printed in House Report number 114-623, offered by Mr. DeSantis of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 783, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, as we've seen with stark clarity recently, Islamic jihadists are on the march, not only abroad but here at home. I think once we have individuals who we know are committed to this destructive ideology and to waging war against the United States in our custody, like we have almost 80 of them at Guantanamo Bay now, that they remain in custody. And we don't want to get in a situation where we're transferring these detainees unwittingly simply because we're on an ideological mission to close Guantanamo Bay. And this facility is a key part of our strategy to fight the war on terrorism. Now, the Obama administration recently admitted that they were not seeking to use an executive order in order to close GTMO's detention facility, and that's a welcome admission because that had been something that had been reported was being considered behind the scenes. Recent news reports perhaps shed light on why this is a non-starter. Recent news reports have shown that at least 12 released detainees have attacked U.S. personnel or allied forces in Afghanistan, and they're responsible for killing at least 6 Americans. So these are terrorists that we had in our custody and then released, and they went out to kill a half-dozen Americans, according to U.S. officials. This is totally unacceptable. So this amendment, which I'm co-sponsoring with Congressman Pompeo, would ban funding to 2 DoD offices whose purposes are simply to close the detention facility in Guantanamo Bay. The facts and the reality show that their mission is unwise and unneeded. My amendment would prohibit funds for salaries or expenses for the offices of the Special Envoy for Guantanamo Detainee Closure and the Principal Director of Detainee Policy. The Principal Director, Detainee Policy's sole mission is to end detainee operations at Guantanamo Bay. And that means either transferring people to the United States or overseas, where we know many of them go back to the jihad once they're released. President Obama also established the Office of the Special Envoy for Guantanamo Detention Closure, which has the same objective. This amendment will eliminate unnecessary bureaucracy and will help keep Americans safe. As President Obama himself begins to give up on his misguided campaign to close GTMO, Americans, especially the people that I represent, can rest assured that none of these terrorists will be brought to their state, nor hopefully transferred to countries that are not going to keep tabs on them. It's time we end funding for these 2 officers and get back to protecting Americans and holding those hardened terrorists in a secure facility we already have that is located off our shores, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
To claim the time in opposition, sir.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is another amendment in the series we've seen today to prevent any movement toward closing the Guantanamo Bay facility, obviously. And it would prevent the expenditure for any officials trying to do that. And a number of myths have been propounded as to why we should do this. Number one, we cannot bring terrorists to the United States. Well, first of all, not everybody in Guantanamo is a terrorist. Some are, some are not. There should be trials. There should be some form of due process. It is un-American to hold people there for life. Apparently, with the people who are in favor of these amendments, this one included, one, is for everyone in Guantanamo to be held forever. Because you can't spend any money to release them, you can't spend any money to close the prison, you can't spend any money to put them in a facility in the United States. You can't spend any money to do anything except hold them in jail in Guantanamo forever for $5 million apiece per year. Now, several reasons have been adduced for doing this. Number one, if they're brought to the United States into a supermax prison, that's dangerous. No, it's not. No one has ever escaped from a supermax prison. And the executive director, Jim Gondless of the American Correctional Association recently submitted a statement for the record to the House Homeland Security Subcommittee stating, U.S. correction systems, both military and civilian, already hold extremely dangerous people, including terrorists, and have done so for years. No matter how dangerous the detainees are, U.S. correction system professionals, military and civilian, have the ability, training, and capacity to take them on. Secondly, we're told that there's a risk if these people are released, and some of them should be because they're not guilty, at some point, they could return to terrorism, assuming they're all terrorists. But the fact of the matter is, the recidivism rate, now it's true that under the Bush administration, 20.9%, 21% of the detainees released under the Bush administration have returned to some sort of combat or insurgent activity. They didn't do a great job in screening under the Bush administration. Under the Obama administration, in other words, for the last 7.5 years, the figure is not 21%. It's a little under 5%, 4.9%. And the White House recently confirmed that no detainees released in this administration, that is to say in the last 8 years, have been responsible for the death of any American. So let's get rid of that bogus point. And again, unless we are going to keep people in prison, and it's also been stated in this floor tonight that we don't want to bring Guantanamo prisoners to a supermax facility in the United States, A, because it's dangerous, which is nonsense, B, because they could radicalize other prisoners, which they can be kept apart from, and C, because they'd have more constitutional rights in the United States than in Guantanamo. Well, the Supreme Court has ruled that prisoners at Guantanamo have exactly the same constitutional rights as prisoners held in the United States. No more, no less. And the attempts to give them fewer constitutional rights are why every single conviction in a military tribunal in Guantanamo has been overturned on appeal so far. They should be brought to the United States or released, depending on the case, tried in a federal court, and put in a supermax prison forever if they're guilty. And if they're not guilty, they ought to be released. That's the American tradition. That's our way of life. It's what we're fighting to defend, at least presumably. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is you inject them into American prisons. The idea that you're going to be able to 100% segregate them, they're not going to be able to radicalize any other inmates, why would you even run that risk? And then in terms of bringing them to trial, the problem is that these guys were not captured under civilian law. They were captured under the law of war. And if you're expecting our troops to amass legal cases against people who they're capturing in war zones, that is going to put more of our troops' lives at risk. Because if you're in a hot fire zone, but you need to get evidence to make sure that that could withstand the court of law, they should be held under the law of war, not under civilian laws that Americans would be. And then, I'm sorry, I don't care if Bush released a detainee or Obama. It's not about partisan games for me. If detainees are released in Afghanistan and they kill Americans, that's a bad thing. And I don't want to repeat that. And the people who are there right now are some of the most radical detainees. These are people that have been reviewed for years, and no one would have ever thought that they should have been released. So why on earth would you want to run the risk of putting more of these guys out into circulation, given that we know Americans have already been killed? I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
How much time do I have left?
1 1/4 minute.
I'll yield myself such time as I may consume for the moment.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. Number one, they can be segregated in federal prisons in the United States, and maybe they should be. Number two, some of them are indeed great terrorists, and some aren't. Number three, they may have been captured in war zones, but they weren't in uniform, which means some of them may not have been combatants. That's what has to be determined. And if they were combatants, they can be held under the law of war. But if they weren't combatants, and they haven't committed any crimes, they should be released. There has to be some due process. We can't hold people in prison forever with no trial, no due process, because we think maybe, and remember, some of these people we offered bounties to tribes in Afghanistan. And like the Hatfields and the McCoys turned into McCoys, and we don't really know that all the McCoys were guilty of anything or engaged in combat. We can hold them under the laws of war. We ought to at least have some sort of review to find that out. And it is not true that the people left there, all of them are the most dangerous. Some are not, and we owe it to our own traditions not to mention, to figure out the difference, not to mention the fact that to hold them in the United States costs $34,000 a year. To hold them in Guantanamo costs $5 million a year each. And who's the fiscally responsible party today? I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Well, look, a lot of these numbers, I mean, they get round-the-clock medical care, halal meals. I'd be fine with curtailing that. But if we could have paid that money to save those American troops, I'd pay it every day, every single day. And I'm a little confused by this argument that we would actually reward people who are picked up in combat zones when they're not wearing uniforms. That's essentially rewarding these guys, the terrorists, who are not wearing insignia. They're not following the laws of war. And so to then give them a civilian trial where if someone actually followed the laws of war, they'd simply end up being held under Geneva III, to me, that totally skews the incentives. So I think it's a good amendment. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for the roll call vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida will be postponed.